It's felt like it's rained constantly lately, but last weekend I could finally sketch outside again. And what better place to be than Britain's best preserved medieval village, Lavenham. You might have seen me sketching here before in some of my previous videos, and with its leaning timber-framed buildings, it's almost like a film set. In fact, the Vere House and the Guildhall were in fact used in Harry Potter films in a kind of modified format. And the Crooked House was the inspiration apparently behind the English nursery rhyme, There Was a Crooked Man. And the reason I was in Lavenham today in the first place was because I've sketched a lot of these buildings before and turned them into mugs, cards and coasters. They're sold in a few different places locally, including a boutique and the tourist information hub. And they'd actually sold out recently, which is obviously always really lovely to hear. So today I was dropping off another batch. After I dropped them off, I decided to sit in the square and sketch the bakery. Painted Suffolk pink with the wooden beams and that iconic old green Hovis sign, it felt like a good subject. And there were even benches directly opposite in exactly the right position. Slightly less perfect, however, is that this is basically the middle of a car park. So my main decision, as it often is, was whether to draw the cars or not. But there were so many everywhere, blocking parts of the view, that I didn't really have much choice. Well, I did have a choice. I could have walked around, found a clearer angle, or even taken a photo. And there is an irony to this story, which I'll come to later. But at the end of the day, it's an urban sketch. And urban sketching is really about drawing what's actually there, not what you wish was there. So I left them in. The pen I'm using is an Esterbrook Esty. In a couple of my recent videos, you might have seen me using the Charles Schulz 75-year anniversary Peanuts Esterbrook. And I liked it so much that, yes, I went and bought another one. So far, I have to say, I'm really enjoying using it. I'm using my normal ink, which is platinum carbon, and my usual sketchbook, which is a Sea White of Brighton A5 landscape. In a recent video, I asked if there are things that you tend to avoid sketching, and cars came up several times. When I draw them, I don't try to draw them exactly. I kind of get the basic shape. I'm just concentrating and drawing the lines and shapes in front of me. It did feel really good to be outside sketching again because, like I mentioned, it felt like it's just been constant rain lately. And while I can put up with sketching in the cold, fountain pens and ink and rain don't really go together. So I've been drawing indoors quite a bit, anything really, from mustard jars to plants in my living room. Draw this in your style challenges, even the inside of a bar when I met up with an old friend. But I've also been practicing ways of simplifying some of the things that I don't always find easy to draw and things that I often avoid. And I'll share some of those in a later video. One of the things that I like about sketching in Lavenham is you don't have to worry about straight lines. I mean, there just aren't any. Here I'm making it a bit easier to judge the length of the roofline by drawing the windows in first and kind of using them as a sort of unit of measure, if you like. So I'm looking at the negative space to the left of the first window and leaving an appropriate gap, and then drawing the width of the window itself. Then looking at the negative space between the two windows and leaving another gap, and then drawing the next window. So rather than just guessing the length of the line, putting the windows in first does make it a bit easier to estimate. If I get it wrong and I get it too short, I can easily add a bit on, but obviously it's a bit harder to disguise if I go way too far to the right. Today I knew I was going to be pushed for time, so my original intention was to just sketch the bakery. However, as usual, I got carried away and moved on to the neighbouring buildings to the right. And as you can see, the chimney here has suddenly become much shorter in my version than it actually is in real life, simply because I didn't identify it as my highest point and leave enough space on the page for it because I wasn't intending to draw it. And to be honest, I've had to squash down the bakery roof itself a little bit to fit it on. But these things happen and you can tweak them a bit. I certainly wasn't going to give up or start again from scratch just because of that. Another decision to make was how to interpret these timber beams. Do I just paint them in, or draw them and then fill them in with paint, or just use ink? In the end, I decided I wanted to show the dark contrast, so I drew the outlines and filled them in with ink. I started drawing the lines of these awnings and then decided to do the same technique as I used before and use the windows to help me get my proportions right. So this is the point where I ran out of time, and the irony is, having not wanted to walk around the cars and take a photo and draw from a photo, I ended up going home and drawing from a photo. But the most important thing is I started it there, I did most of it there, and on another nice day I may go back and do it again, with or without the cars, who knows. I try to constantly line things up with each other and use other things as a reference. For example, these dormer windows. I'm checking where they are in relation to the 4 windows below them, and I'm also making sure that they're both at the same height. For the roofs and the roof tiles, I'm holding my pen really lightly and not worrying if it lifts off the page, and also not worrying about straight lines, as I already mentioned, as this is Lavenham. And then once I've added a few horizontal lines, I just add a few random vertical ones here and there, just slightly slanted. Now I've switched to a Fude nib pen to add those branches and twigs that are growing up on the outside of that wall, and also to fill in those timber beams that I mentioned earlier. I'm going to have to remember to make sure they're completely dry before I start adding paint. I did this once before using a Pilot Parallel pen, which has got a much wider nib, and the ink really takes a long time to dry when you use that, and I didn't wait long enough. And permanent ink and paint, a bit like permanent ink and rain, don't really go very well together. Once I got home and had more time to think about it, I did decide to add a hint of the pink building on the far right. There wasn't room to include much of the building, so I didn't want to add loads of detail, but just enough to show that there was something there and not just empty space. I also blackened in some of the deeply shadowed areas, again using the Fude nib pen, and then it was time to get the paints out. You might notice that there's one solitary black car tyre, and that's because I started filling them in with a Pentel Pocket Brush pen, which I thought were water resistant, but I have had an issue in the past with it bleeding. I don't know if that was my fault because I didn't wait too long because I was too impatient, but I didn't want to take the risk again, so I decided to wait until I'd applied the watercolour wash and come back to it. The watercolours I'm using are a Sennelier set, and you'll notice that there's more than the standard 12 half pans that come with the set, but I did have another small Sennelier set which kind of combined the two, and I've also added an extra couple of half pans from another couple of palettes that I use. A yellow ochre, because I do find that I use that colour quite a lot, and a Suffolk pink, which is very handy for the houses around here. Although I prefer to complete the whole sketch on location, I don't think I'd have managed to get the depth of shadows if I'd been waiting for it to dry today. Even though, you know, there was a bit of sun, it was still quite damp. It's still late January, early February. So I would have had to wait quite a long time to actually get it to dry properly to add proper shadows. And there were some really dark areas in those deep windows and doorways, and I don't think I'd have managed to have got those if I had been sitting outside. So almost the final touch was coming back to that Pentel pocket brush pen and just filling in those black car tyres. I usually leave cars more or less completely white, apart from the odd brake light or yellow number plate for just a little pop of colour. But today I just added just some very subtle shadows and greys, just to make them blend in even more really. And here's the final sketch. So I hope you enjoyed that little trip to medieval Lavenham. Thanks for watching.